When we start to consider a backup strategy and doing database backups on our SQL Server 2005 data, the first thing we need to be concerned about are the database recovery models and which one in particular we have chosen to employ. Now, there are three basic database recovery models. They're simple, bulk logged, and full. Now, I've alluded to these in a number of different places in the series so far, but now we really want to zero in on them and explain exactly what they are and how they're going to affect you. Now, before we take a look at each of them individually, I want to go out to the management tool and show you how to set these on a database. So I've switched to the SQL Server Management Studio, and if you'll notice on every one of my individual databases, if I just simply right-click on a database and go to Properties, you will see the Database Properties dialog box appear. And if I click on the Options navigation choice, you'll notice the second item in the drop-down box is the recovery model. Notice full, bulk, logged, and simple. Now, this is where we choose these, and just notice that I can choose any of these, and I have to set them each individually on every individual database. So this is a database by database setting. Now, let's go back out and talk about the various models and how they're going to affect you. Okay, the first up is the simple recovery model. Now, in the simple recovery model, be aware of this. Transactions get deleted from the transaction log when they're committed into the database. Now, what that means is transactions get written into the transaction log. We wait for a commit to happen. As soon as that commit happens and that gets written into the database, they disappear out of the transaction log. Now, what does that mean? It means the transaction log cannot be used to restore our data. So we can't do the point-in-time restores. We have to depend on our full backups, differential backups, and so forth. This is not acceptable for most production environments because we have large databases that simply take too long to back up and restore that way. So this is not what most people use. Now, this is a fantastic model to choose for development servers, test servers, and so forth. In these situations, a lot of times you have programmers hitting a SQL server to test programs and so forth. The data that's in those databases is test data. It's very fluid. It's being thrown in there. It's being truncated out and so forth. So in those situations, we don't want to worry about the transaction logs getting large. We're not worried about data restores. So the simple is fantastic for that. Just be real careful about using that simple. The bottom line is you cannot restore data from your transaction logs when you're running simple. Now, the full recovery model, all of your transactions are fully logged in the transaction log. Everything that happens to the database is fully recorded inside the transaction log. Now, that's great, except all of those transactions are retained in that transaction log until a transaction log backup occurs, and you have to explicitly execute a transaction log backup. Now, when you do that, as soon as in the backup process it sees a committed transaction, it knows that that committed transaction has been written into the database, and as soon as it has been written onto the backup media, then at the end of the process, all those are dropped or truncated. You'll hear that term a lot, truncated from the transaction log, which means the transaction log shrinks to the size of the number of uncommitted transactions. So uncommitted transactions are all that are left in that transaction log after a backup. So the bottom line is if you're running the full recovery model, you'll have to periodically do transaction log backups on your transaction logs, or they will continue to grow and eventually fill up your entire disk. And if you remember in the videos on the jobs, if you've seen those yet, we created a job to do a backup, and we could have easily created a transaction log backup job to watch for that transaction log, and when it got too large to simply back it up. Then we have a copy of the transactions in a backup, but they're no longer in the transaction log. The full database recovery model is the Microsoft recommendation for all production SQL Server databases. Now, this may or may not fit you, but for 99% of the people out there, it will. Let me show you when it won't fit you. If you're doing large data imports into a database, the full recovery model may not be what you want to do because, let's say you're importing 100,000 rows of data. It's going to log all 100,000 rows into the transaction log and then commit those into the database. It's two actions to get that in there. You may want to turn that off for those imports. You certainly don't want to use a full necessarily for data warehousing and so forth, as long as you understand that you're writing it into the transaction log first, then into the database, and it's just not as efficient. Then last but not least is the bulk logged recovery model, and with this one it minimally logs bulk operations. Now, what is a bulk operation? BCP, insert select, bulk insert, write text, anything with write text or update text, select into commands, create and alter DBCC, DB reindex commands. Now, by minimally logged, it simply logs in the transaction log that these happened, but it doesn't keep details. Now, you can use this for restores, but I would point you out the documentation to see how to use them. So that's the 3 recovery models and how to set them. Now let's move to more aspects of doing backups in SQL Server 2005.